Why does British food have such a bad reputation? I'm Ben Henderson, and this is Here for the History, the show where we uncover the origin stories behind the stereotypes and traditions in everyday life. Today, we'll find out how British food was crushed by the Industrial Revolution, how we're still living with the legacy of wartime rationing, and we'll spend plenty of time blaming the French. So, is British food a crime against cooking, or is this all part of a foreign plot to do down Britain? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, hype, and subscribe to follow the show. So I was on the train the other day from London up to Manchester where I live, and I'd packed this absolutely glorious sandwich. There was beef and it had some mustard in there and the horseradish. I took it out of the foil packaging. I was like, oh, I can feel the smell.
An elite train picnic.
Oh, it was absolutely fantastic. And I can't take credit for actually making it. It was my dad. But I was absolutely enjoying myself tucking in. The crumbs are flying all over the person opposite me. And it really got me thinking, British food is a bit underrated, I feel. It doesn't really get the credit it deserves. But then I started doing some research on my phone, and then I came across this absolutely disgraceful meme that I've seen a few times before, actually. I'll read it out to you. So it says, "Heaven is where the police are British, the chef's Italian, the mechanic's German, the lover's French, and it's all organised by the Swiss. Hell is where the police are German, the mechanic's French, the lover's Swiss, it's all organised by the Italians, and the chefs are British."
No, that's outrageous. That is outrageous. But I think you're right that many people do have this perception that British food is terrible. And we do see it all the time. I mean, there's that quote from 2005 from the former French president, Jacques Chirac. And he said, "You can't trust people who cook as badly as that," in reference to the British. He said, after Finland, it's the country with the worst food, which I think is totally unfair.
Disgraceful. That's worthy of a diplomatic incident, that. And I mean, I think it's quite unfair too, because, the British, we do make, lovely cheeses. You've got Welsh lamb, Scottish beef. We've got great chocolate compared to the Americans in particular.
English sparkling wine.
Yeah, exactly. And then, our staples like our roasts, breakfasts, fried breakfasts, all this kind of stuff. These are some of God's great creations. Yeah. And Marmite, don't forget Marmite. I don't think it's justified, to be honest.
I suppose it's interesting how when you go abroad, the smart restaurants, the posh restaurants, if you like, they're never English food, whereas the equivalent in London say that they would have quite smart Parisian restaurants, I think. So perhaps that's a good marker, but something perhaps we can change today.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this set me on a trail, that question you've just raised. I really tried to pin down when and why this bad reputation for food in Britain came about. So this is my take, Alice.
Well, I'm excited to find out. So Ben, let's dive into it.
Chapter 1, Blame the French. So, Alice, in Chapter 1, we'll be putting the blame firmly on the French, I'm sure you'd be pleased to know.
Already? Great. Love to see it.
Well, they're always causing us trouble. Anyway, so I thought a good place to start would be around the 1500s, because at this point, basically, British food is regarded as pretty good, even by our European neighbours.
Okay, so just to set the scene at this point, we're in the Tudor age. Henry VIII is on the throne. He's a king who maybe would be out hunting on his horse, hunting a deer, perhaps one of the enormous feasts prepared for Hampton Court Palace. But that's that's where we are at the moment. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. But it's important to remember first that, the vast majority of people don't live like that in the slightest. Mm-hmm. Your average Brit is living out in the countryside in a rural village, and their daily meal would probably be made up of basically a bit of pottage, which is like a vegetable stew. It'll be seasonal. They might be able to thicken it up with some grain. Mm-hmm. If times were good at the right time of year, maybe they'd put in a bit of pork or something like that, a little bit of meat, a little bit of fish. And they'd have some bread as well to go along with it. And then, they might have access to a communal cow for a bit of, dairy stuff. Maybe they'd have some chickens. So it wasn't a totally unhealthy diet. There just wasn't a huge amount to go around, because a huge amount of the year, like once the harvest's done and food runs out, they're really struggling. So there will be periods of the year where starvation is a genuine issue. So they've got to make the most of it. And so they'd eat every bit of the animal, and maybe they'd take the intestines, for instance, and stuff it. So that's where, the haggis comes from.
Quite right. And I am a big haggis stan, so I will not hear a bad word about it.
I didn't have you down as a haggis fan.
No, it's great. I think it's very easy to cook. That's why I like it.
You've cooked it. So what? You get an intestine and stuff it with?
No, not. You can buy that from the shop. You can buy it from Tesco. But...
I assumed you'd be doing it from scratch.
Yeah, well, thank
I thought
you.
it was a historian. You know.
I'm glad that you think I'm so thorough in the kitchen.
What are you putting in your haggis then? I couldn't actually pin down like a recipe for this is haggis. Lots of people seem to do their own different ones.
Well, I think when you buy haggis today, you buy it literally just as this kind of circular form. So anyway, I couldn't tell you, but
once my dad cooked it, but I've never tried it other than that.
Well, it is delicious. I'd recommend it, and cheap.
I'll give it a go.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So back to the history.
Exactly. So one of the characteristics of food at the time is it's no worse than how peasants are eating, say, in France or Spain or on our European neighbours.
Okay, so we're on a level playing field at this point.
Absolutely, yeah. And then at the very top of society, you've got King Henry, as you mentioned earlier, and his pals, and they're really, really known for their hugely elaborate feasts. And basically, one of the key characteristics of Tudor elite food at the time, which I think people might find a little surprising, is that they actually heavily spiced their food. They had a lot of sugar and a lot of spice, even to meat. And so it wasn't bland in the slightest, like we might think.
You reckon it would actually be quite tasty?
Absolutely, yeah.
Do we have any kind of original sources?
Yeah. So there's a great one from an Italian traveller at the time in the late 1500s. He's called Mario Savognano. He was a very aristocratic man, and he comes over to England in the late 1500s, and he says, many Englishmen eat 5 or 6 times a day and more of meat than of anything else, so that there are more butchers seen in London than in any 2 of the chief towns of Lombardy.
Whoa, 5 or 6 times a day? They're living it up.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you can see here, even a cultured Italian man has a pretty high opinion of British food. But the thing is, in the coming century, things would start to change as we come under attack from a familiar foe, the French.
Of course, the French. So tell me, what have they done this time?
So I've been speaking to the food historian Diane Purkiss about this, actually. So she's written a wonderful history, a social history of food.
I love that book.
And I think the first thing to point out is that since the Norman conquest, so back in 1066, when William the Conqueror came over to England and invaded with his Norman warriors, English or British and French cuisine have had a lot in common. But in the 1600s in particular, things start to change in France. France is slowly becoming one of the dominant powers in Europe. And what this kind of instigates is a competition among much of the nobility in France to outdo each other. And it becomes a sort of kind of culinary arms race, basically.
Sounds fun.
Yeah. And so they use cooking as a way to show their status and their prestige. And what emerges from this is a kind of new, kind of more refined French cooking. It's basically a move away from that old medieval style of cooking or Tudor style of cooking that I mentioned earlier with the roast meats, heavily spiced, loads of sugar. And they rely more heavily on things like aromatic, local, seasonal herbs. On top of that, you get they use thickening agents to essentially make France's, iconic sauces that are still with us to this day.
This is the age of the ragout, the fricassee?
Absolutely, yes.
And what is it exactly?
So a ragout is basically, I don't want the foodies to have a massive go at me, but I would say that a ragout is essentially, you've got your meat, and then it's basically a nice thick stew with some vegetables thrown in there. Whereas a fricassee is more like a white stew, so you'd have maybe chicken in there, much more creamy, rich, and all this, it's emerging from these noble courts, and then it actually starts to be codified, which is a huge moment in the history of French cuisine. So people start writing down the rules for how to make this stuff, and I think it's in 1651 you get this absolutely seminal book. It's by a guy called Francois de la Varenne, and it's called Le Cuisinier François, and it's essentially seen as laying the foundations for modern French cooking.
It's been made all a bit more official. What is going on in Britain at this time?
Right, so as I mentioned, de la Varenne publishes that book in 1651, but in the decade before, the 1640s, England has fallen into civil war, essentially. The king is basically overthrown. The king's son has to go into exile in France, and in exile in France, his son, who's the future Charles II, develops a taste for French cuisine. Now, I think we should probably just paint a little portrait of Charles quickly. So,
Absolutely. I mean, Charles is one of the great figures from the British monarchy. He was known as the Merry Monarch, the Party King. He had this wonderful, long, brown, curly hair. At least that was his wig. Looks a bit like the guitarist Slash from Guns N' Roses.
Often compared,
If
yes.
that helps paint a picture. He's born in 1630, so he's 12 years old when the Civil War breaks out. And you're right, he spends some pretty formative years during the interregnum, which is 1649 to 1660, and that is spent in France. And then, of course, when he comes back, he is known as this great party king, loves having a good time, has many mistresses and illegitimate children.
You paint the picture perfectly. Charles is out in France, and as I mentioned earlier, him and his courtiers, when they're out there in exile, start to get a taste for the high life. They start to enjoy the French cuisine that's emerging at the time. And so, when the monarchy's restored in 1660, they bring it back with them. And the kind of elite circles of when people they go to their beautiful dinners at these elaborate feasts, they'll start serving French cuisine. It slowly kind of percolates through society.
So Charles II really brought it over.
Yeah, absolutely. So that means from Charles's court outwards, you get increasing adoption of French cuisine, the fancy new stuff with the thick sauces, as I mentioned earlier. But then there are crucial developments across the Channel in France. So the new king of France, called Louis XIV, and he plays an absolutely seminal role in the development of French cuisine as well. So basically, I think, again, pull back the camera. Who was Louis? I guess he's always remembered for the way he develops Versailles, the palace. He didn't initially build it, but he expanded it massively, built that wonderful garden with the amazing design and, the Hall of Mirrors.
Okay, so he's got quite a flair, this man.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And for our purposes, the important thing is he absolutely loves his food. And essentially what he does is he makes the French court absolutely the envy of all these other courts around Europe. And what's the effect on, the nobility in England? They've already got a taste for French cuisine, and they're looking across the Channel and seeing that's what prestige looks like, that's what status looks like. And over the period of, the 1600s into the 1700s, we see the accelerating adoption of French cuisine. And we can see it in some of the writers from the time, can't we?
This is from Hannah Glass, who was a great influential cookery writer
Yeah,
at the
one
time.
of the greatest.
And so she's like Delia Smith of her
Pretty much, of the
day.
1740s, yeah.
And she wrote, "So much is the blind folly of this age that they would rather be imposed on by a French booby than give encouragement to a good English cook."
Yes.
What is this, a French booby?
Well, my understanding from a quick Google is a booby was more like a fool or an idiot, a mug, basically.
Okay. I think that's important context here.
But the thing is, lots of her recipes in that book are also French influenced too.
Yeah,
so I think they're basically, they're standing there trying to withhold this French tide of cooking that's coming, and they're not happy with it. But over time, they're having to deal with it. Absolutely,
yeah.
and you can see this around Britain actually, because so in the 1780s, Robert Burns, the iconic Scottish poet, he writes his Address to a Haggis, and the context for that is at like a dining room, and he's basically seeing all this French influence on the table, and he's saying, no, like, this is the good honest haggis, this is good honest stuff that we should be eating. And it's all part of the same vein of history. Reputation
management of all the food, basically.
Pretty much. Well, he's just saying, what's going on? Why are my friends here at this dining table eating all this foreign nonsense when we've got haggis on the table we could be eating?
Quite right.
So we've got 1780s, Robert Burns writes that poem, but the point is this continues for centuries. And as late as the 1920s, you get Virginia Woolf, the famous writer. She has a servant. She actually sends her servant to one of these iconic French restaurants in London to bring back the recipes because she's so sick of English food. And I think in the To the Lighthouse, one of her famous novels, she has a very well-known quote about English food said by one of her characters. She says, "What passes for cookery in England is an abomination. It is putting cabbages in water. It is roasting meat till it is like leather." So I think we get from all this that the English elite, and British elite more broadly, have definitely, since the Civil War, turned towards French cuisine as That's what high status looks like.
This is around today. I mean, I feel like I still think about French food as more sophisticated. Is that fair?
Well, I imagine Alice Loxton dinner parties are riddled with French food. You can't get
wish.
a roast beef in there to save your life.
I wish. No, my dinner parties are probably more of the rugged
Oh, really?
English sort. Yeah, cottage pie.
Pure haggis.
No, yeah, I have. Well, there we go. I have served haggis before and cottage pie. I think it's more feeding the masses is the approach.
Yeah,
not what Virginia Woolf would have approved.
I
of.
like that, a cottage pie. That's good, sturdy stuff.
And my top tip for a pudding is chalk ice. Just give people loads of chalk ices, but so definitely not kind of sophisticated French food, I don't think.
I'm looking forward to my next invite.
Yeah, come. You can come and see what you think.
Exactly. Yeah, I was hoping just then. I was waiting. The pause was for you to extend it.
I see. This is the invitation. Okay. Yeah, you are officially invited, Ben.
Thank God. Done it. This podcast achieves anything.
Yeah.
That's it. All right. So through this process that we've outlined, we can see how kind of British cuisine is knocked off its perch at the top level of society. Yeah. But at the same time as all this, our peasant cuisine is coming under attack too. Chapter 2. Get off the grass. Okay, so in chapter 2, we're going to talk about how the rural peasants that we described earlier, living in the Tudor period, the 1500s, are slowly but steadily kicked off the grass, out of their villages, driven off the land into the big industrial cities that are popping up in the Industrial Revolution. And our peasant cuisine is really, really trash, to be honest. So it starts with, I think we need to outline a few concepts here very briefly. I won't bore you to death. But I think you're probably familiar, Alice, with the idea that, if you own a piece of land, you're the only one who can do anything with that land, right?
Okay, registered, yeah.
Yeah, but that wasn't always the case in Britain. Okay, so back in the day, this is going right back to medieval times, so, from around 1000 AD to 1500 AD, a lot of the land in Britain was called common land, and people had common rights to it.
Okay, so like Wandsworth Common?
Yeah,
That's still part of it?
Yeah,
Clapham
so
Common?
that's a classic example. Yeah, and Wandsworth Common. I've got many memories buying a few tinnies from the Nisa local. I remember just next to Wandsworth Common.
Formative years.
Yeah, exactly. It's my earliest drunken memories. Good times. Yeah. Anyway, back to the highbrow historical narrative.
So people were relying on this common land for, I guess, their food. Is that the point?
Exactly, yeah. So just very briefly, you'd have this common land and members of the local community would be entitled to do things like graze their animals on parts of it, to grow their own food, to get firewood, which is essential for baking. But slowly and surely, over the course of a few centuries, but really accelerating from around the 1700s, you get the big landowners who own the majority of the land around start to stroke their chins slightly, a bit like Dr. Evil kind of vibes, and just say, you know what? Why don't I just assert my ownership over this land? And slowly they kick the peasants off this land.
Okay.
They go to Parliament, they petition for what's called enclosure, which is where the land is no longer open to common rights and common grazing. They put fences around the land, and the peasants are basically shoved off the land. And this means that their food lifeline, as we mentioned earlier, is basically taken away. We've got a peasant from Malden in Bedfordshire who describes what happened to his personal situation. He says, "I kept 4 cows before the parish was enclosed, and now I don't keep so much as a goose."
Oh dear. Yeah. Okay, so quite big changes at this point. Big scale of change.
Absolutely. So I think between 1604 and 1914, there's more than 5,000 enclosure bills. And this basically encompasses over a fifth of the area of England. So you get a sense of just how absolutely earth-shattering this change is for the peasantry.
And how does that change British food and British cuisine?
Basically, the peasant food has been absolutely ravaged. I was chatting to the great food historian, Sam Bilton, about this. And she agreed that it essentially cut the peasantry off from their supply of fresh meat and veg. And as I mentioned earlier, the firewood, which is essential for baking bread. And it undermines that peasant cuisine, which I think if you look abroad in any culture is so important to developing a rich food culture. And it's a big reason why Britain is so lacking in that department.
But hang on, I mean, surely the same sort of thing was happening in Europe, presumably.
Yes. Yeah, so in Europe they did have enclosures too, but this happened at a much slower rate and much later than it happened in Britain. And so I suppose the effect was less pronounced in Europe.
So we've got all of these displaced peasants. Where do they go?
All right, so they've left. They've obviously been driven off the land. But at the time, Britain is going through an absolutely enormous period in our history, the Industrial Revolution.
Ah, yes. Okay, so this is a big moment, I suppose, when Britain shifts its focus from being an agrarian society, so people working from the land, and towards cities and an industrial society where I suppose great technological innovations happen. Is that
Absolutely.
fair to say?
Yeah, precisely. And this happens between roughly about 1750-ish to about 1850. And, it's always symbolised by those chimneys belching out smoke and the massive factories.
In my mind, I'm visualising Charles Dickens's characters.
Absolutely, yeah. And we can get a bit of insight into what they were actually eating from a physician called James K. Shuttleworth. So he was in Manchester in the 1830s, and he says that breakfast for cotton factory workers consists of tea or coffee with a little bread. Oatmeal porridge is sometimes, but not often used. And then for lunch, this is particularly appetizing, it's boiled potatoes, and he says the mess of potatoes is put into one large dish, melted lard and butter are poured upon them, and a few pieces of fried fat of bacon are sometimes mingled with them. And then they come home for their dinner, and that consists of a meal of the coarsest food, which is prepared with heedless haste and devoured with equal precipitation.
Yeah, so you get an impression there that people are pretty unhealthy in their way of living, a terrible diet.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, we've already said they've been cut off from those regional cooking traditions out in the countryside. They come to these factories hoping for a better life, presumably, and they don't have the time, they don't have the facilities, they don't have the energy to be able to make anything nice, to be honest. And I mean, I was talking to the historian Peter Brears, who's one of the daddies of English food history, and he was saying that it's also, as we heard there, this is a time when children and women are increasingly going into work outside the house. And obviously, they'd been the backbone of a lot of cooking for so many centuries. So once they're not involved anymore, you're not going to get that wonderful knowledge passed down the generations.
Okay, so do you think this is quite a big moment in the reputation, a fair reputation, that British food isn't quite what it used to be?
Well, yes. I mean, so one of the things that's always thrown at us that I see online is our love of baked beans. And this is a kind of time when things like tinned food becomes more increasingly popular because, you've moved to the cities. There's not the refrigeration around, initially at least, to be able to preserve all your food. So it's an interesting time, and it, quite formative, I think, on our future reputation.
So baked beans, is that a British thing?
I think it was actually perhaps introduced by the Americans, but don't quote me on it. But I do have a good stat on it for you.
Okay, go on, hit me.
So in my research, I found that the British eat more baked beans than the rest of the world combined. So yeah, I think that's pretty
The
impressive.
British eat more baked beans than the rest of the world combined. Wow, that is quite a lot. Is that to the fact that the British people eat a lot of baked beans, or do people elsewhere just not eat them? I mean, do Americans know what baked beans are?
I think they know, but mainly by insulting British people.
Okay,
That's
fine.
the only time I ever see Americans post about baked beans online. It's when they're saying, this is what British people eat every day, 3 meals a day.
Well, for anyone listening or watching, baked beans are a delicacy.
Yeah, they're a
here in
joy.
Britain.
A bit of Marmite on your toast and some baked beans in there.
I think that's right. Marmite on toast, then baked beans, then cheese.
Although I've seen my girlfriend have chips and baked beans, which I think is a bit, just dipping your chips in.
I think I'm for that. I think any combination actually works.
Maybe that's the...
I'm with her on that.
I'm just being the fancy Frenchman. I need to go and reassess my life, sort myself out.
Go home with your fancy French cuisine.
But yeah, the only thing is there are some upsides from all this. You get the popularisation of things like the sandwich, the pasty.
Oh,
yeah.
What a perk.
And of course, the sausage roll.
Oh, yes. This is brilliant.
Yeah, so there are, and I mean, actually, lest we forget fish and chips.
Okay.
That also becomes hugely popular in this time. So there are some upsides, but I think it's fair to say those things aren't really regarded as great delicacies abroad.
No, that's true.
Yeah, I mean...
It's quite rugged food, isn't it?
Exactly.
And as pasty was developed so that you could put it in your pocket as an all-in-one meal.
Exactly, for miners, wasn't it? So it's that kind of thing. It's about adapting food to the environment these people were working in.
So it's quite working class, all of these British foods.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's the big point here.
Well, the upper classes, as we said, are busy fawning over the French.
Yeah, well, all fool them.
Yeah. Well, but this is you've illustrated it perfectly. We've got an elite that are looking to the French, and we've got a working class that are being oppressed by the effects of enclosures and industrialization. So our food isn't in a great place.
Okay.
And this takes us to perhaps the main reason for our terrible food reputation, and that is Second World War rationing.
Okay,
Yeah.
exciting. Well, before we dive into it, before we go into the air raid shelter, as it
Ooh,
were,
very good.
let me just remind everyone watching, thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to like, hype, comment, and subscribe, because there's a lot more history to get through. Okay, Ben, Second World War, let's go.
Okay, so Second World War rationing is going to be our chapter 3, and it's probably, as I mentioned, the biggest factor in our terrible food reputation. Okay. So first, I think we just need to briefly cover why rationing was needed. And the main thing is, pre-war, we were an island nation. We relied very heavily on imports from abroad. But when the war starts to bubble up, Hitler is, his U-boats are sinking all these cargo ships that are taking food to Britain. So the government in Britain is obviously a bit worried that we're going to run short of food. So things have to be rationed and limited.
Okay, talk me through, how does rationing actually work? 'Cause that's always been something that I've never really got my head around.
You're given a ration book. So even King George's mother, Queen Mary, had a ration book herself. So in your ration book, you'd have a little coupon. You'd have to register with the shop you were going to buy your specific product from. And then you'd buy it with money at a subsidised rate set by the government, so it was more affordable. And then you'd have to cross off that little coupon in your ration book.
So you have to be quite organised, a lot of forward planning. What was it actually like, do you think, to live under rationing for people?
Well, we can see that through the diary of a woman called Joan Strange. So she lived in Worthing at the time. And I think there's a nice little entry from July 1940 that I'd like you to read, Alice, from Joan's diary.
Oh, okay. Here we go. So the food controller broadcast this evening that tea is to be rationed to 2 ounces per person from tomorrow. Also margarine. Later that month, she writes, the Havant Davises, who must have been their friends, came round to tea, but they had to bring their own tea and sugar. No way. So bring your own B, Y, O, T and S.
I don't know if that's going to catch on, Alice. But yeah, no, exactly. You can see she's starting to feel the pinch. There's so many items rationed that I can't go through all of them, but it starts with bacon, ham, butter, sugar, and it gradually progresses over time, basically. But one of the things I found particularly interesting, which is useful for the future direction of our cooking, is that things like sugar and fruit are rationed, imported fruit. And so Brits have to become a lot more inventive about how they cook. And so you get things like British root veg being used as a replacement for sugar because of their natural sweetness. Things like
genius.
So things like parsnips, beetroot, maybe a bit of rhubarb, carrots. And it leads to all sorts of very strange concoctions. So you've got carrot fudge. Don't know if you'd fancy trying that.
Sure.
And then my personal favourite, which, I won't judge it. I'll see what you think. So this is from a woman called Mrs. Farrow. So she'd say that her mother would create banana sandwiches. So these banana sandwiches were basically made up of parsnips with a bit of food colouring in there, a bit of yellow food colouring, mashed up, stuck between two slices of bread, given to Mrs. Farrow, and then her mum said these were banana sandwiches, and she said they're delicious because she'd never tasted a banana before, so she has absolutely no idea.
So funny. Well, I couldn't comment, but I'd be happy to try it.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting because although we laugh now, it does mean that this turn towards having to use British produce creates some nice benefits and some interesting innovations that we still have today. So you get the rise of the crumble, which I think is
great moment.
iconic in British cooking. And it reminds me when I was a kid, I'd always go up to my grandmother's house in Hartlepool, and she'd always, she's very old fashioned. I think she would have been evacuated during the war actually, and she'd wheel in a little trolley, a hostess trolley, the only way she served any food.
Quite right.
And then she'd always lift up this lid of this bowl, and underneath there'd always be a big steaming hot rhubarb crumble.
Delicious.
Yeah, and she died when I was very young, but that is the abiding memory I have of her.
Yeah.
That smell always kind of takes me back. I think what we have to point out is that it means a whole generation of Brits basically were raised without the ingredients to cook in a really nice way. And if you think that's, rationing, it didn't just end at 1945 when the war ended. It goes on for another 9 years and actually gets worse during that period, which is absolutely bananas. I think a lot of people forget about that. And
or no bananas in this case.
Well, exactly, yeah. And it just means that, for such a huge period of time, British people just don't have access to the products to make good cuisine. And inevitably it suffers because there's a hangover. Things like scrimping on meals becomes a bit of a national virtue almost, you know.
See.
That the idea of spending lavishly would just, you know, that's not seen as the done thing anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, and it lasts, you know, I think the reputation lasts almost to this day.
So I can see you've picked up this quote here from the great writer George Orwell. And he's writing at the end of the war. He said, "It's commonly said, even by the English themselves, that English cooking is the worst in the world."
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh dear. Okay, so does it ever pick up? Come on,
Well,
I want some good news here.
I'm happy to say, Alice, after the war, in the later 20th century, things do start to improve. Chapter 4, British Renaissance.
Okay, this is an exciting moment. You're going to talk us through the Renaissance, the rebirth of British cuisine. I can't wait.
Absolutely. So, I mean, things do start from a pretty low bar. So you mentioned that Orwell quote, things aren't going well. But post-war, there's an economic boom. There's prosperity, you know, people have money to spend. And into this milieu emerge some great food writers. So most notably, there's Elizabeth David, who starts writing around the 1950s. You also get writers like Constance Spry, Patience Gray. And what they do is they start to look abroad and they start to reopen Brits' eyes to the glories of Mediterranean food. So you get much more of an embrace of, you know, your fashionable Italian or your lovely French food that's coming back after this period in the war where we could barely eat anything, basically.
This is the arrival of pasta, I guess.
Yeah,
That's pretty exciting. For university students, that's a big moment.
And it's the normalisation of this food in, say, middle-class households. That's the key. And it's really boosted by the fact that foreign travel is becoming increasingly affordable. And then alongside this, you get these new waves of immigration coming in from the 60s and 70s onwards in particular. And this brings, you know, the popularity of cheap British staples like the curry, Chinese. You know, these things had existed before, but they become much more popular in this period onwards.
Okay.
But that begs the question, okay, so what's happening to that traditional British food we were talking about earlier? Because I don't think you could really say us having a lovely gnocchi for lunch or something like that, or a chicken tikka masala is really elevating British food. I know some people say, well, it is British. I'm kind of like, I don't think many foreigners would give Britain the credit for the embrace of curry, for instance.
No.
So in 1984, you've got I've picked out this quote from a New York Times journalist who says, "Go to Spain, a much poorer country, and you will find in the simplest of bars a delicious assortment of tapas, the little nibbles that accompany so well a glass or two of fino. But go to an English pub, and you're in danger of finding nothing more appetizing than a Scotch egg, which consists of a hard-cooked egg rolled in sausage meat, usually served stale to go with your pint of beer."
But a Scotch egg, I mean, that seems to me a kind of smart staple of the gastropub.
Well, a brilliant segue there, Alex, because we are coming to the gastropub.
Exciting.
In 1991, we get the start of a revolution, the gastropub.
Exciting.
Yeah, so this is led by two restaurateurs, Michael Belbin and David Eyre. And basically they take over a pub called the Eagle in London. And what they do is they add a nice selection of wines, but also they extend the kitchen. So you can actually make some decent food in there. And this starts this whole gastropub revolution. I know some people aren't a massive fan of the gastropub. They see it as gentrification, but for our purposes, the gastropub has definitely improved the quality of British food over the last 35 years or so. And there's so many different ones I could pick out, but the key element of a gastropub that has made it and improved British food is the emphasis on, you know, British produce, often serving traditional British food.
They talk about nose to tail. Is that right?
Yes, well, I mean, not all gastropubs serve nose to tail, but the interest in seasonality, localism, British produce places the gastropub in a kind of wider movement called the modern British movement.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and this is where nose to tail comes in, because the pioneer of the modern British movement is often said to be a man called Fergus Henderson, very well named. And he set up a restaurant in the mid-90s called St. John, which is also in London. And they became very well known for this nose-to-tail cooking that a Tudor peasant might recognise.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
So they might full circle.
Yeah. So they might serve, you know, a pig's head or something like that. I don't know would you fancy a pig's face?
I'd try it. I tried anything once.
Yeah. So St. John is... it's indicative of a much wider trend with many other restaurants where there's this emphasis on British produce. It becomes such a trend that it's built a whole infrastructure around it. This infrastructure involves, you know, loads of artisan cheesemakers, loads of bakeries, foraging, market gardens. All this kind of economy has built up to supply these restaurants with this good local British produce. And I think this has done a lot to undo the damage that we talked about earlier, where the peasant cuisine was destroyed by industrialization and the enclosures.
Well, this is very exciting. I mean, things are looking up. We're maybe becoming rivals once more with our French neighbours.
Yes, and I have some stats to prove this.
Okay.
Yes, I've done some research. So there are nearly 70 Michelin-star restaurants serving predominantly British cuisine now in the UK, which I think is pretty good going. And it's actually more than the number serving American and Spanish food combined. So next time the Americans laugh at your food, Alice, yeah, you can tell them that.
That is a good stat, and I'm glad to hear it. That's a good place to end, I think, this week's episode. It's been a real tour de force, Ben. Thank you so much. I've loved hearing about the kind of changes in land, the common, Clapham Common history spoke particularly to me. Thank you so much to everyone for watching at home. Don't forget to like, comment, hype and subscribe. Tell all of your friends to join the history fun. Next week, we're going to be looking at the history of the English language, which is a really fascinating subject. Until then, enjoy your history. Thank you so much, Ben, and join us next week.
Goodbye.